Hi, everybody. This is the first time I'm trying this format of Twitter Live, so still sort of getting used to this. I guess I'm supposed to start, so let me just start right away. Um, I'm Kashyap Deorah, author of The Golden Tap. I started my first company in '99 when I was still a college student in my final year, and then um, a year later, the internet bubble burst happened somewhere in the US, and I was in college in India. And it took a few months before I got to know that there is some internet bubble burst that happened, and I needed to do something about it. And then my next company was again started in India in 2007. Um, I had built a product, built a team, done a test market, and I was ready to launch. And I had told VCs, not to, uh, fund me. I'll only take angel money until I'm ready to launch. And now I was ready, and that time was September 2008. And all the VCs were interested. When I spoke with them, they said, come back when you're ready. And then I went back, I think, second week of September in 2008. And suddenly the tone changed. And once again, it took me some time to figure out what was going on, and then a long time to absorb the fact that I will not be able to raise money in this environment. The Great Recession has happened, the big home loan crisis, which led to a global recession in 2008 and 2009. And then finally, in 2015, when the Indian startup scene was booming, I was busy writing a book called The Golden Tap, where I predicted that there would be a bubble burst, which will impact India the most, more than US and even China, which was quite involved in that bubble burst. And in fact, I'd written chapter 9 or chapter 8 in the manuscript while I submitted it for editing, saying these are the possible scenarios that will lead to the bubble burst, because this is all in the private market, so it won't be a public market crash that will directly impact and so on. So here are the scenarios. And one of the scenarios was a public market crash in the China market and how that will impact India. And after submitting the manuscript, it turned out that that scenario out of the 3 or 4 I had laid out actually happened. I think this was August 2015. So I actually withdrew my manuscript that I'd sent to Roli Books and the editor, and I reworked that chapter saying, okay, now that this has happened, this is what's going to happen next. And indeed, many of those events happened after. So, the 2015, 2016 was an interesting time for tech startups in India. And now we're in 2020. From a tech perspective, from a financial market perspective, we've been on a 12-year boom cycle. And out of nowhere, here is this random event, which is a health scare. The world is shut down. It's a peculiar sort of virus, which is lethal on the one hand, 10, 20 times more than the flu. It feels like the flu, but it's far more lethal. It's a respiratory virus. And on the other hand, it's very contagious. It's contagious before symptoms show up. And a combination of that leads to, a fairly logical conclusion that we should all stay home, right? That's how the cookie crumbles. And what that means is all the essential consumption has just been wiped out overnight. To share one statistic there, during the global recession, the first quarter GDP degrowth, the actual consumption degrowth, was about 2%. And with coronavirus, the first quarter GDP degrowth in the US is likely to be 20 to 25%. And that's how drastic that drop is. So I think one thing's for sure, we are entering a recession, but pretty much everything after that is unsure. So that's sort of the time we're in. So what I'd like to do today is, take your questions. I believe you can post your questions on Twitter in the same thread, and I will answer those questions. And that's sort of going to be the format of the rest of this. So let's see here. This is my first time trying to do a Twitter live, so please bear with me. Oops. Trying to see where the questions are. Thanks for bearing with me. Trying to see where the questions are. Okay, so here's one. How long do you think this global slowdown will last, and what kind of reforms can the governments provide to startups? Got it. I'm trying to figure out this screen. Give me a second here. Well, so I would say from a startup perspective, so the question is, how long do you think this global slowdown will last, and what kind of reforms can the governments provide to startups? Look, governments are around the world are doing things to ease the pain, but there's only so much a government can do, and we're all dealing with larger recession. It would be safe to say, every person to himself or herself. I would say you need to buy yourself 6 more months to stay where you are. I'm on my 4th startup. I'm very much in the thick of this as a tech entrepreneur, trying to tide through these times, and I'm sort of putting my money where my mouth is. The first thing I did after assessing the situation is you need to buy yourself 6 more months to stay where you are. And during this time, it will become more clear how things are going to shape out after the situation comes back to the new normal. It won't come back to the same normal as before, so if you're looking for that to happen, don't do that. Just let that go. Go through your 5 stages of grief. There will be a new normal. We don't quite know what the new normal will be. Those who can lead that and think for themselves and have that thought process will be well served. But right now, I think, looking at what the new normal will be is probably going to be hard. Financially, buy yourself 6 more months than whatever your plan was, right? If your plan was that you're out in 6 months, then just hit the pause button or stop working on that idea right now, right, and reassess the situation later. If your plan was a 12-month plan, make cuts or do things that get you to an 18-month plan. If it was 18, get to a 24-month plan. Let's see. Next question is, are there any new opportunities for some businesses or any businesses in this slowdown? I believe so. I think there will be several new opportunities in the new normal. If anybody claims they know exactly what's going to go on, that's I don't think the world even knows what's going to happen. So there will be new opportunities. It's not exactly clear what those would be. What we're seeing right now is anyone in health, whether it's brick and mortar or digital, is actually seeing an increase, and health is probably the only sector that is seeing an increase. We keep hearing about food and groceries and online, Zoom, for example, Slack, remote work, and so on. There has been a temporary growth. There will be, some of that is going to be temporary, be permanent. How exactly that shakes out for which industry, time will tell. There is also, for the picture that we see on the top, there are lots of challenges on the other end. I know that food delivery, for example, overall has seen a dip and not a growth. Lesser people are, more people are just trying to get by at home and cook and avoid external contact, and sort of the overall consumption there has decreased. In grocery delivery, what I'm seeing both in the US and in India is the demand is multiplicatively higher, but the supply is actually very volatile. Workers are not showing up, or they're very scared, and in some places they are on strike. It's really hard for these companies right now to predict the supply side. Similarly with the Slack stock, we saw high volatility in the market, and there's some stories around there, of how much to value it going up and down. If I take one more step back, I would say the planet is breathing now. I think, to me, at a philosophical globally has been put to a reset. This is very much a consumption correction kind of recession at the core of it. If the 99-2000 cycle was about the internet, and the 2008-2009 was a debt and financial crisis, this one is very much a consumption crisis. And from that perspective, I think it's healthy that we're going through this sort of correction, where I believe the world was on a consumption overdrive because of the 12 years of rally. And a lot of things which are discretionary consumption, we sort of convinced ourselves were mandatory consumption. And that thing has been reset, that computer has been reset. So once it boots up, where it lands up will be an interesting question. So I would say keep an eye on everything renewable, clean. Despite oil price crashing, that's another event that's happened in parallel with the coronavirus scare. But despite that, I think look at clean and renewable, and also look at the new consumption patterns that will emerge after this. I'll take the next question. Okay, so Naresh is asking, what are the features of startups that are disproportionately likely to succeed in this environment? It's a good question. I would say there are multiple dichotomies here, wartime and peacetime, right? So this is definitely wartime. Anticipate change, anticipate uncertainty, think for yourself, act now. Whenever your brain says, let's wait and watch, and it's very typical in uncertain times to just wait and watch, let it shake out, let's see where it ends, right? That's going to fail. Don't do that. You have to think for yourself and make a prediction of what's going to happen and act now based on that prediction, right? So that is sort of the war dynamic, where when you're in a war, you know that things are happening everywhere as we speak. So you can't be on the front line and say, let me wait and watch what the enemy does. Let me wait and watch how, this whole thing shakes out. So this is definitely wartime dynamic. Another dichotomy here is growth versus survival, right? And I would say the more survival-oriented startups, which kind of goes contrary to the war thing often, aggression and war kind of leadership is often coupled with ambition and growth. But I think, resist the temptation to collapse those two things. You need wartime leadership. You need a wartime team. You need the team to know that, this is the time they were hired for, not for peacetime, but for these. Welcome every idea, welcome everyone thinking for themselves and collaborating about where they think things are going to shake out and what we can do about it. Some of the best ideas will come from the places you expect least. So yeah, flat organizations will do well. Wartime organizations will do well. Those who are focused on survival rather than growth will do well. Figuring out how to squeeze out that 1, 2, 3 extra months of burn, even those ideas will come from places you expect the least. I went through a similar cycle just a couple of weeks ago, and I was surprised how much people stepped up and said, oh, if this is the goal that we're shooting for, if this is the number we're shooting for, we're a very open, transparent culture company at Hypertrack. And we spoke about, look, this is what our current burn is. We need to buy ourselves 6 more months. And these are the problems we need to solve in these next 3 to 6 months. I'm just looking 1, 2 quarters out. I'm not even able to look at what will happen beyond that. We need to get to this level of burn and at the same time add some of these things which are required to solve that problem, right? Which means we need to cut deeper here and then make room for the additional burn that we need to sign up for. I was surprised people stepped up and said, okay, let's do this or let's do that, or I'll go optimize that AWS cost, or, a senior leader said, I'm going to take a salary cut to this extent. Do you think that's going to be useful? Will that help? I took a salary cut, for example. So, when you're expecting your team to do something, you sort of step up and do that as well. The other thing, Naresh, I would say is, wartime does not mean lack of empathy. In fact, there is strong bonding, strong camaraderie, which comes from strong empathy. And I think taking the time to ask the team about their health, their family's health, their what they're dealing with. Some might be dealing with a health situation um, which might be not related to coronavirus, but just related to staying at home, or someone in the family was going through a health situation that they cannot take care of because the hospitals and the healthcare system is overloaded, or maybe there's a financial system, or a financial crisis at home at some place. So make room for people to be able to express that and um, clarify what they're sort of going through. Do those Zoom parties and happy hours. We did a happy hour which really worked well, and we said we're not going to talk about work, and we will just bring a glass of wine or our beer and hang out for an hour. And it was amazing how human behavior adapts. We quickly had it felt like we were at the office, just doing our Friday evening thing. Let me think. There are some people trying to post questions. Do you think young entrepreneurs and small businesses in India trust their government's ability to help them tide over these times? It's a good question. I think in India, look, you could call it a little cynical, but I've grown up, in a business family, taught that a business happens despite the government, not because of the government. So I would say, if you're running a business, you're an entrepreneur, don't count on the government to do anything. I believe the government will do a bunch of things. Some of them might trickle down to you, some of them might impact you. Keep an eye out on that, like any other external factor that you keep an eye out on as a business. But do not count on anything. Don't hold your breath on anything that anybody else will do. Not just the government, but you're on your own. We're at war. You need to think for yourself. You need to think strategic as well. How is this going to shake out over the next 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months? What do I need to do now? Get your house in order. I would not count on something that the government does that my business depends on. Next question. Will investors start pulling out due to poor half-yearly performance? It's a good question. Just a second. I'm going to see if... Okay, so I think someone at Roli Books is responding to people who are trying to submit their questions. So we're all set. Yeah. So, will investors start pulling out? So, the first week of lockdown here in California, I'm in the Bay Area. There were 3 companies with term sheets that got withdrawn. Just my network, right? One of them was a seed startup with a Series A term sheet that got pulled out. The other is a high growth startup with top tier VCs, top of the line VCs already on the cap table and on the board, and another fairly one of the best corporate ventures had a Series C term sheet to them, which got pulled out. I don't think investors are even waiting for a poor half-yearly performance. Whichever investor can withdraw their term sheet is doing so right now. the media is full of stories about this, and I'll tell you why this is happening. At the same time, by the way, there are big funding rounds happening. Um, Notion raised a ton of money in a matter of 36 hours, apparently, over video calls, right, at a valuation of $2 billion. There are companies announcing rounds. These rounds might have happened before COVID and being announced now, or there are rounds being closed over video as well. But overall, the trend is that investors are waiting and watching. This is very much a recession. And the thought process is this. The thought process is actually not related to your financials or your performance or your position as a company. I think that's the most important thing to note. So all these term sheets that got pulled out, these are perfectly healthy companies. Some of them are not going to be impacted that much by the recession. But the reason the investors are pulling out is there is an overall market crash, and that will lead to a liquidity crunch. That will lead to LPs wanting more liquidity, or not being able to invest money into funds. That will mean funds not being able to make more investments. So the strategies are going to change across the board, and there will be a trickle-down effect. And that sort of happens in every recession. Once you've been through 1, 2, 3, 4, you sort of realize that that's how the cookie crumbles. So what's important to know is, don't take any of this personally on yourself as well as on the business that you're running. You should anticipate that investments will dry out, will freeze. If you have existing commitments that you're counting on from a cash perspective, assume that there will be some bumps there, or delays there, or even things getting pulled out. It's more to do with financial markets rather than you. And I think the other side of this as well is investors are going to do this until we see the bottom of this. So for investors, they're also sort of running a company like you are. They need to understand how to allocate and shake out their future strategy. So the wise thing for, if I was an investor, I would do the same thing. I would just freeze right now, and I would want to see, where the tides are. So basically, what's the phase of the moon going to be, right? So at some level, the primary bit there is, where is the market going to bottom out? And by market here, for tech, I would say just NASDAQ. So if you're speculating, is the market at the bottom right now, or is the market has already bottomed out and coming up? That's not the case right now. I think people are just waiting and watching. It's very volatile right now. It's hard to speculate that, but we're definitely in the thick of it, and it's not clear where it bottoms out. And once that happens, then you will start seeing, in general, investments coming back. Okay, let's see here. So we have Nishant asking, how do you think this is going to play out for Indian consumer startups? Especially curious about Oyo. A great question. This is, I think, for Indian consumer startups as well as globally, US and rest of the world, this is very much a consumption recession. Our consumption patterns, you look at your credit card bills, or whichever way you measure your consumption, chances are your consumption has drastically reduced in these weeks of lockdown. And if this ends up being months of lockdown, we're all sort of deciding what is essential to us and what not, right? And behavioral economists and product managers had all convinced us that everything we consume is essential. But with this reset, with this very physical reset, we know we are all answering that question: what is essential and what's not essential? And a lot of things we even consider essential, we're not able to consume, so it becomes sort of inessential. And then the experiential learning of that is more significant than anything you will watch or read, or you're actually experiencing lesser consumption. So I think Indians in general have the mindset of stretching the rupee far, and consuming less. The consumption economy is a new phenomenon for India. Obviously, there is growth, and there will continue to be growth in India in the long term, because we're starting at a pretty low GDP per capita. I mean, to give you a perspective, I think there's a 30x difference between GDP per capita in India versus US. And there is tens of millions of people, if not 100 million, in that consumption growth sector, which will continue to grow, no question about that. But there will, it will be over the medium term, long term, a lower dip than in the US. I look at my consumption patterns in the US versus India, and US is a consumption economy and on a consumption overdrive. And I think the impact of a consumption-oriented recession is going to be much higher in the US than in India. Now, specifically about Oyo, I would say of all the industries that, let's take the top 20 industries. Obviously, hospitality is, travel, hospitality is up there. That industry has been hit the worst by far. Like, if you take the top 20 industries in the world and see percentage degrowth or the impact, travel and hospitality is at the top. I have customers in the hospitality industry, more on the restaurant side, and there's 80% dips, 90% dips. People are not, taking airplanes and trains and buses to go from one place to the other. So they're not looking for a place to stay. I had a spring break plan with my family. I was looking forward to that for a long time, have not taken a vacation in a long time. All of those plans got cancelled. I have summer plans to come to India. I'm keeping my fingers crossed, but there's a 50-50 chance right now. When this whole thing started, I would have said, oh, by the summer, there's 80%, 90% chance I'm traveling, but now I would say it's a 50-50, maybe even lesser. So, I believe in general, if you are in a combination of you need cash and industry where consumption has just stalled overnight, that is a very rough place to be. And so everybody in hospitality will get impacted asymmetrically more. And we think of it this way as well. Once the consumption does come back, people do start traveling, there's, people are going to be wary about traveling a whole lot. We will avoid traveling. There was a 9/11 effect where, most people said, I don't know if I want to get in an airplane right now. And the airplane industry saw a recession for a good 2-3 years after 9/11, whereas, I thought it was the best time in the world to travel because everything is so secure. You kind of know there's a lower probability of any bad incident happening. But I think consumer behavior is often predictably irrational as well, where I think the muscle memory of not traveling, not staying at, staying out or touching too many foreign things is going to be very much part of our system for a while. So we'll have to see how much and when it comes back to, a good place where it actually ends up. Okay, I see one from Kapil. So in China, tech companies played a big role in controlling the spread of corona and tracking infected people. Can the same be done in India? Which companies? A great question. That I think as a global phenomenon, I would say we're seeing that tech is leading the charge in dealing with coronavirus. And this is not just software or digital tech, it's very much hardware, equipment, health as well. And India is no different. In fact, I have been working with Paras and Mikin have launched this coronavirus hackathon called Coronathon in India. They were very quick to respond, and the kind of response they got from the startup community was just phenomenal. And the way we got pulled into it was, one of the projects there wanted to use location tracking, looked us up. We looked up Coronathon and we said, listen, any startup who wants to build a live location app can use Hypertrack for free. So during the COVID-19 response phase, unlimited usage, just use it for free. And we saw startups build quarantine patient tracking apps, self-quarantine citizen tracking apps where citizens are voluntarily saying they will get tracked, social distancing apps, essential service worker apps where you're sort of watching the safety of essential service workers and also making sure that their customers and their teams and their communities are safe. Overall sort of, hotspots of the virus and trends around how that's moving around. So if you just take one perspective, which is location tracking, that's the world I live in, there were like half a dozen very actionable, legit ideas that came out. And a lot of my nights right now are spent on the phone with India, helping developers or, troubleshooting stuff. And the tech industry, I would say, has really risen up to the challenge. And it is a sort of groundswell movement. Food delivery companies are distributing food to migrant workers who probably have the biggest brunt of it from an India perspective. The biggest sufferers of the coronavirus are the migrant workers. And a lot of their woes are unrelated to the virus itself, unfortunately. And, I know that grocery delivery companies are working very hard to get orders. So, yeah, I do believe that the sort of bigger picture adage of every company in the world is a software company now, or every company in the world is a tech company now. Software is eating the world. By that token, for a virus of this proportion and this much impact, the tech companies have that ability are probably the only ones with the ability to scale up and distribute that fast, right, than any other industry. So all of the ideas applied to solving the coronavirus crisis, primarily to slow down the spread of it before we can all build immunity or build a vaccination. A lot of those ideas and their distribution is coming from the tech industry, and I believe it is happening in India, and we all need to sort of unite and do more and more each day to contain the spread. Let's see. So how job secure are startups for the next 1 year? It's a good question. It's, I think it was the second or actually even the first, even the internet recession Um, one of the after the bubble burst, I sold my company to a private company in Silicon Valley. I moved out here. The acquiring company pivoted their business, and as part of that, I was actually fired from that company. Uh, you know, because the previous CEO had acquired my company, and that didn't go well with the new CEO, and he wanted to make a statement, and they were making cuts and so on. And then the next company I joined was caught in the downturn where post-internet bubble, if you remember, a couple of years later, 9/11 happened, and that sent some industries further down, especially the data center and storage industry in which I was employed. Um, and yeah, my sort of sense at the time, I was out looking for a job. I was applying to the Googles of the world, as well as 2, 3, 4-person startups where my heart was always. And I knew I was not ready to start my next one, but I was looking for a job and trying to find a good home for myself. And it was on my mind that startups are not going to be secure places to work. And at the same time, what was happening all around me was big layoffs in big companies. And in startups, at least, there is some degree of meritocracy or control or influence you have over the outcome. In a larger company, you get a pink slip and it's at your table, and then you leave and you can't really do much about it. And if you are hopping from one large company to the other, in recession times, it becomes that mobility gets quite limited. There's always phenomenal people who never have a problem finding a job, but in general, I think job security will impact everybody, not just startups. So that's my view on it. Of course, with startups, there is a bigger survival crisis for a lot of startups. It's not a proven business yet. That's why it's called a startup. But on the other hand, you have higher visibility into what's going on compared to a big company. Right? In a big company, what happens in the boardrooms, what decisions are being made, are often outside your control and view, whereas in startups you have far more control. So it's a combination of yes, your job security is pegged to the survival of the startup, which is by definition lower than a larger company, but at the same time you have more visibility and control over the outcome. So I'm being told there's time for a couple more questions here. So let's see. Any difference between startups in India as opposed to US and elsewhere? That's an interesting one. I think I have a fairly macro view on it, and that is, US and especially US, but US and Europe are what I would call consumption economies. The reason the economy is large and is because the citizens at large consume a lot, and even the smallest nuisances, we call it the developed world problem, right? You have these little nuisances which we can't afford in the rest of the world, but the developed world is like, oh yeah, I will spend money to solve that problem. And that leads to that consumption overdrive. And I believe the current times are basically cutting that consumption overdrive and resetting that to, hey, developed world, figure out what's essential and not. And the other thing about the is the viruses are new to them, right? China, Singapore, Hong Kong have seen viruses. India, Brazil, most of Africa have seen deadly viruses. you'll have stories in your neighborhood of people who passed away of dengue and malaria and chikungunya, right? If you're in India. And similarly, those in China and Hong Kong have stories. Those in Africa have stories about Ebola. It's a lot of the learnings here are experiential learnings, and I think the developed world is new to this virus. The response also has shown that the US in particular is understanding what this thing is. Italy, Spain tell you that Europe went through a similar cycle. So I think a combination of that, I think consumption will hit the developed world harder, as well as the impact of the virus and what it leads to. Relative to that, I think India will have a lesser impact, but we are a densely populated country of a lot of people, so the damage can be a lot if things go out of control. And just this is a kind of virus where random things can spin out of control. Hopefully, the story about us being BCG vaccinated and warm weather, neither of them are substantiated scientifically, but there seems to be some anecdotal evidence. So if that turns out to be true, that BCG vaccination and warm weather make it harder to spread, then that keeps us in good shape health-wise. And on the economy-wise, I think the dependency on consumption is lower. I look at China as a manufacturing economy, India as a trade economy, and US as a consumption economy. So in general, I think consumption economies will be hardest hit. I think I can take my last question now and then call it a wrap. So Kapil is asking, what's the one most important piece of advice you would give a startup founder right now? One. So I'm thinking. It's buy yourself 6 months. Act now to get yourself 6 more months on whatever plan you're on. So 6 more months to stay where you are right now. And just do that immediately if you haven't already done so. And I will give 2 more things, by the way. So buy yourself 6 more months. The other thing is it's about leadership, I guess, which startups are about and startup founders are about. You starting a company because you have a vision about how the world should be different than what it is. And this is the time to think for yourself and have the courage to act on it. Whenever you're running a startup, you go through when are you external facing versus internal facing. And when you are in inward facing mode, it's often you get into that habit and cycle of just keeping on doing, your process at that point in time. You've got to snap out of it and get back to sort of thinking for yourself right now. And once you do, I think having the courage to take a stand and do the right thing, it's going to be difficult in these times, but this is the time to do it. So think for yourself and take a stand. Buy yourself 6 months. Okay, guys, thank you so much. This was phenomenal. Thank you for the opportunity, Kapil, Priya, and Roli Books. Thanks everybody who watched and participated with questions. This was fun for me. This was a fun way to spend the morning. And as a fellow entrepreneur, we're in this together. Let's beat the virus, flatten the curve, and get back to a better planet and a better humanity. Take care. Have a good weekend.